Regarding my identity.
Regarding my identity.
Regarding my
Understanding my privilege.
Understanding my privilege.
Acknowledging the weight.
Regarding my identity.
Regarding my identity.
Understanding my privilege.
Sometimes in having these
Acknowledging the weight that my identity holds.
Acknowledging the weight that my identity
Sometimes I feel unsure of where and
Understanding
where.
having these
Acknowledging
conversations,
the weight
I
that
feel
my
unsure
identity
of my own
Sometimes I
voice.
feel unsure.
Sometimes
how
in
I
having
hear
these
my language
conversations, I feel unsure of my own
Sometimes
voice.
I feel unsure
Sometimes
how
I
can
feel
use my
unsure
language.
and where and how I can use my
how
language.
I may be walking a fine line.
Sometimes I feel the weight of
unsure
knowing
of
how
how
my
I use
voice
my language
speaks
and
on
feel
behalf of
productive
my
of my own
identity.
Sometimes
I
I feel
realize
unsure
that I
of
may
where
be
I
walking
can
a
use my
fine
language in
line
an
and
inclusive
should
way.
Sometimes I feel unsure of how I can
Sometimes I
use
feel
my
the weight
language in a
of
productive
knowing my
way.
voice speaks
That I
on
may be
behalf of
walking
my
a
own
Sometimes
fine
I
line
feel
and should
unsure of
expect
how I can use
realize
my
that I
language
may
in
be
an
walking a
inclusive
fine
way.
Sometimes I
line
feel the
and
weight
should
I
expect
realize that I may
criticism
be
from
walking
me.
a fine
of my
line.
identity.
I realize that I may
It
be
is clear
walking a
to me
fine line and
that
should
having
expect
dialogue is
interpretation
important.
from an
It
audience.
is clear to me that
I
having
realize
dialogue
that I may be
about
walking a
these
fine
things
line
is
expect
important.
criticism from an
It
audience.
is clear to
I
me
realize
It is
that I
clear
may
to
be
me
walking
that
a
having
fine line
dialogue
and
is
should expect
important.
misinterpretation from an
It is
audience.
clear to me that having
realize
dialogue
that I may
about
be
these
walking
things
a
It
is
is
fine
clear
line.
to me that having
clear to me that having
dialogue about
dialogue
these
is
things is important.
It is clear to me that having dialogue about these things
I
is
still
important.
feel
It is
nervous
clear to me
to
that having
talk
dialogue
about
about
these
these
things.
things is
It is
important.
clear to
I
me
am
that
supposed
having
to feel
dialogue about these
It's
uncomfortable
clear to
things
me
is
that
when
having
having
important,
dialogue
these
about
but
these things is
still,
important.
I feel
Sometimes
nervous.
in having these
He made
conversations,
I still
I
feel
feel
nervous.
I still
uncomfortable
feel
when
nervous
having
to
these
talk
I'm supposed
about
to
these
feel
things.
uncomfortable when having
These
these
conversations
I'm
conversations.
supposed to
I'm
feel
supposed to be
uncomfortable
made
when
to feel
having these
uncomfortable when having these
conversations.
conversations.
I'm supposed
These
to be made to
conversations
feel
are supposed
These
to
uncomfortable
open
when
up a
conversations
having these
feeling that is hard to
conversations.
feel. These
Sometimes I feel the
conversations
weight
are
of
supposed to
knowing
be
that my voice
These
speaks on
conversations
behalf
are
of my
supposed to be hard to
identity.
put into
These
words.
conversations
We have to feel uncomfortable in order to make them real
These
change.
conversations are supposed
I
to be
realize that I
larger
may
than
be
words.
walking a fine line
We have
and
to
should
feel
expect
uncomfortable
criticism from an
in order
audience.
to make real change.
moments of discomfort.
There is no way to make change
Discomfort
without going
is
through
the
moments of
only way
discomfort.
to
I realize that I may be walking a
Discomfort is
fine
the only
line
way to
and
achieve
should expect
change.
misinterpretation
The
from an
narrative
audience.
around discomfort needs
It
to
is clear to
change.
me
We
that
We
having
should not be
dialogue
afraid
is
to
not be
grow.
afraid to
Sometimes
grow.
I feel
We should not be
unsure and
afraid to
wary
learn.
of how I
Not
can
be
use my
We should not
language.
be afraid to
learn.
change.
Sometimes I feel
We
unsure
should
of
not
how
be
I can
afraid
use
to
my
talk.
language in a
We
productive
should
way.
not
There's
be
no way
afraid
to
to
make
be
a change
confronted.
Sometimes I
without
feel
going through
unsure
a
of
moment of
how I can use
discomfort.
my language in an inclusive
We
way.
should
Discomfort
not
is
be
the only
afraid
way to
We
achieve change.
need to
The
listen.
narrative around
We
discomfort
need
needs
to
to
It's clear
change.
to me that
We
having
We should not
dialogue
be
need
afraid
about
to
these
grow.
things
We should not be
is
afraid to
important.
learn. We should not be
I
afraid
want
to
I want to
change.
be
It is clear to
cautious
me that
not to
having
put
dialogue
words in
about
other
these
people's
things
We should not be
mouths.
afraid to be
in order to
I
confronted.
want to be
change.
We need
cautious.
to listen.
I want to be
We
cautious
need to
not to
listen.
overstep a line.
It is
I
clear
want
to
to
me
be
that
cautious
having
not to
dialogue
put
is
words in other
important.
Not to
people's
make
mouths.
assumptions.
It is clear
I
to
want
me
to be
that having
cautious not to
dialogue about
overstep
these
a line.
things is
I
important.
want to be cautious
I
not to make
realize
assumptions that I do not have the
that
authority
as
to
a
make.
person in
I
a
want to be
dialogue,
cautious not to
a
make
lot of my
assumptions
job
that
is
I
to
do not
listen.
have the authority to
There
I
is
make.
realize that as a
circumstance.
person
clear
in a
to me
conversation,
that having
a lot
I
of my
realize
job
that
about these
is
things
to
as a
listen.
person in dialogue,
important.
a lot
Regarding
of
the
my
issue
job
of
is to
But I
narrative
still
and
listen.
feel
It's clear
nervous.
to me that
There
having
is an
dialogue
issue
I
about
still
these
I
feel
things
realize
nervous
that
to
as
talk
Regarding
a
the
about
person
issue
in
of narrative in
conversation,
our
There is a
culture,
problem.
there's an
I am
issue
supposed to
regarding
feel
the narrative
Acknowledging
in
the
our
weight
culture.
that my
regarding
identity
the
There is
holds.
issues
circumstance.
of narrative in our
I'm supposed
culture.
There's a
to
problem
There's
There's
regarding
an
the narrative
issue
in our
regarding the
culture.
narrative in our
There is
culture.
having these
There is a
conversations.
problem regarding the narrative in our culture.
Narrative comes with circumstance.
Narrative comes with circumstance.
Life is
There's a
defined by the
circumstance
narrative.
to a narrative.
It is who writes the narrative.
Narrative
Who is
comes
in
with
power.
circumstance.
How do we change
It
the
is
narrative
clear to me that
that
having
defines
dialogue
life?
about these things is
How do we
important
change
in order
the
to make a
mental
change.
governs life?
These conversations
I
are
see that
supposed to
narrative
open
shapes
up
the
a feeling
language we use.
that is hard to
Life
feel.
I
is defined
see
by the
That
narrative.
These
narrative
conversations are
shapes the
supposed to be hard.
connotations within our
It
words.
is who
These
writes the
I
conversations
see
narrative,
that
who is
narrative
in
supposed
power.
to
shapes
be
the
hard.
It is who
connotations
writes the
within our
narrative.
words.
Who is in
I
power?
see that
We have to
narrative
feel
directly
How do we
uncomfortable
change the
in order
How do
narrative
we
that
change the
defines
narrative
life?
that
Language
defines
we use
life?
directly
How do we
affects
change the
our
There is
narrative
no
that
way
governs
to
The
life?
make a
words
How do we
change
change
that
the
we
narrative
without
that
going
governs
through
life?
I
directly
see that
affect
narrative
our
shapes the
lives.
language we
Regarding
use.
my identity.
The words that we use directly
Regarding my
shape our
identity,
perception of life.
understanding my
Acknowledging the
privilege,
weight
The narratives that we
Regarding my
use
identity,
directly shape our
identities,
perception
Understanding my
of
privilege,
how we are
acknowledging the weight
The
that my
language that
identities
we
hold.
use shapes
I
how we
realize
are
that I
to
may
relate
be
It is
to
clear
each
to
other.
me that having a
The
dialogue
language that
about
we
these
use
things is
shapes the
important, but I still feel nervous.
I see that narrative shapes the language we use. I see that narrative shapes the connotations within our words.
The
Discomfort
language
is
that
the
we
only way
use
in
shapes
which
the
I feel
limits
unsure of
around
I
my
still
life.
feel nervous to talk
the
about these
narrative
things.
around
Sometimes I
discomfort
feel
Is
unsure
photography
of the
mainly
way.
concerned with
The words that we
Acknowledging
use
the weight
directly
that my
affect our
identities
lives.
hold.
photography?
Sometimes in
aware that
having
it
these
creates a
conversations,
narrative?
I feel unsure of my
Are
own
we
voice.
aware?
I'm supposed to be made to
Sometimes
feel
I feel
uncomfortable in
unsure
having these
of how I can
conversations.
use my
Speak?
language.
I see that narrative
Are we
shapes the
aware that there are
connotations within our
narratives
words.
that we
I see
cannot
that narrative
write?
shapes the connotations that
Are
belong
we
to our
aware
words.
that language
Sometimes
is not
I feel the
confined
weight
to words?
of knowing that my voice
Are we
speaks on
aware
behalf
that
of
language
millions.
Sometimes
is
I
not
feel unsure of how I
confined
can
to
use my language in a
representations and
productive way.
symbols?
Sometimes I feel unsure of how I can use my language in an
Sometimes I feel
only a
unsure and
particular
wary
way
of
to
how I can
change
use my language. It is clear to me that having dialogue
I see
about
that
these
narrative
things is important.
directly affects our
I
lives.
see that narrative
realize that I
shapes the
may be walking
connotations
a
of
should
fine
not be
line
afraid
and
to
It is
should
clear to
expect
me that having
misinterpretation
dialogue
from
about these
The
others.
language we use
things
directly
should not
affects
in
our
order to
lives.
make a
Change.
change.
I see that
It is
narrative
still
directly
clear.
affects our
It is
lives.
clear
Sometimes
to me
I
that
feel
having
unsure
dialogue
and wary
about
of how I
these
can
things
use my
is
language.
important.
The words
But
that we
I
use
still
directly
know
shape our
what
perception
listens.
of life.
We need to listen. I want to be cautious.
I am supposed
not
to
to
feel
put words in
uncomfortable
other
when
people's
having
mouths.
these conversations.
I want to be
I am
cautious
supposed
Sometimes
to
I
be
feel
not to
made to
overstep
feel
a line.
uncomfortable when having these
I want to be
conversations.
The
cautious
narrative that we use
not to make
directly
assumptions
shape our
that I do
perception
not
of how
have
we
the
are
authority
to
to
live.
make.
These
I
conversations are
realize that
The
supposed
words
to
that we
open
use
as a
up
person
directly
in a
shape our
dialogue
perception
that
of
is
life.
hard to
A
feel.
The
lot of
narratives
my
that we
job
use
is to
directly
listen.
shape our
The
perception of
language
how
that
we
we
are to
conversations
use
are
live.
shapes
supposed to be
how
hard.
The
we are to
language that we
relate to
use
each other.
shapes
These
how we are able to
conversations
relate to each other.
supposed to be
The
hard
language that
to
we
put
use
into
shapes the
words.
possibilities of what
Sometimes I
can
feel
be.
unsure of
We
how
have
I
to
realize
feel
that I may be
uncomfortable
walking
in
a
order to
fine
make a
line.
change.
I realize
There
that
is
as a
no
person
way
in
to
a
make a change
conversation,
without going through
a lot
moments
of my
of
job
discomfort.
is to listen.
The
Discomfort is
language
the
that we
only way
use
to
shapes the
achieve change.
possibilities and limits
The
of what we
narrative
can be.
around discomfort needs to
Sometimes I
change.
feel unsure of how I can use my
We should
language in
not
an
be afraid
inclusive way.
to grow. We should not
Regarding
be
my
afraid
Sometimes I
to
feel the weight of
We should
knowing that
not
understanding
my
be
my
voice
afraid
speaks on
to
behalf of
change.
my
acknowledging the
identity.
weight
We
that
should
my
not be
identity
Acknowledging the
afraid
weight
to
that
talk.
my identities hold.
We should not be afraid to be confronted. We
The
need
language
to
that we
listen.
use
I
shapes the
realize that I may be
possibilities of what
walking a
can
fine
be.
line
I
and
want
should
to be
There is an
expect
cautious
issue
not to
criticism
regarding
put
from an
the
words
audience.
in
narrative
other
in our
The language
people's
that we
mouths.
use shapes the limits
I
around
want
what
to
we
be
cannot
cautious
be.
not to
There is a
overstep
problem
the line.
regarding
There's a
the
problem
narrative
regarding
want
the
to be
narrative in our
cautious
culture.
There
not
is
to make
circumstance
assumptions
to
that I
narrative.
do not have the
There
authority
is
to make.
Regarding my
There is
circumstance
an issue
identity,
regarding the
understanding my
narrative in our
privilege,
culture.
It is clear to
acknowledging the
Narrative
weight
comes
that my
with
that
identity
having
I
holds.
realize
dialogue
that
is
I may be
important.
walking a fine
Life is
line
defined
and
by
should
the
expect
narrative.
Sometimes I feel the weight of knowing that my
Only
voice
way
It is
speaks
who
on behalf
writes
of
the
my
narrative
identity.
who is in
I
power.
I realize
realize
that I may
that
be
as a
walking
How do we
person
change
in
the
a
narrative
dialogue,
that defines life?
a lot
Is
of my
photography
job
aware
It's
that
clear
it
to me
creates a
that
narrative?
having a
governs
dialogue
life.
is
Are we aware that
important.
there are
I
narratives
see
that
the
we
It is
cannot
clear to
speak?
me that
narrative
having a
shapes the
dialogue
language
about
we
these
use.
things is
Should not be
important.
afraid to grow.
It is clear to me that having a dialogue about these things is important
Are we
in
aware
order
that
to
there are
make
narratives
These
that we
change.
cannot
conversations are
write?
supposed to open up a feeling that is
I
hard
realize
to
that
feel.
I may be walking a fine line and should expect criticism from an audience.
I realize that I may be walking a fine line
I
and
realize
should
that
expect
as a
I
criticism
realize
person
that I
from
may
an
be walking a
Are we
audience.
fine
aware
line
that
and should
narrative
expect
is only a
misinterpretation.
particular
It
way?
is
Sometimes
clear
I
to me
feel
that
unsure
having a
how I
Regarding
can
the
use my
dialogue
realize
about
language
these
in a
that
things is
productive way.
important,
our culture.
but I still feel nervous.
There is an issue
I
regarding the
still feel
narrative in our
nervous to talk
culture.
about these things.
I see that
I'm
narrative
supposed to
shapes
feel
the
uncomfortable when having these
connotations within our
conversations.
words.
There is
The language that we
circumstances to
use
narrative.
shapes the limits around
There
what we
is
cannot be.
circumstances to a narrative.
These
Narrative
conversations
comes
are
with
supposed
It's
to
clear
open
to
up
me
a
that having
feeling that
dialogue
is
about
hard
these
to
things is
Life is
important,
feel.
but I
defined
still
by the
feel
narrative.
nervous.
It
These conversations
is
are
who
supposed
writes
to be
the
hard.
narrative who is
I'm
in
supposed to
power.
feel uncomfortable when
These
having these
conversations are
conversations.
supposed to be
I'm
hard to put
supposed to
into
be made
words.
to feel uncomfortable
We
when
should
having
not
We
these
be
have to feel
afraid.
uncomfortable in order to make
These
real
conversations
change.
are supposed to open up a feeling that
There's
is
no
hard
way
to
to
feel.
make
I
a
see that
change without
narrative
going
shapes
through
the
Conversations are
connotations
supposed to be
that
hard.
belong to our words.
These conversations are
Discomfort
supposed
is
to
the
be
only
hard
way
to
to
put into
achieve
words.
change.
It is clear to me that
There
having
is no
dialogue
way
about
to
these
make a
things
change
is
without going
important
through
in
We
my
have
order
to
words.
feel
make a
uncomfortable in order
change.
to make real
How do we
change.
change the narrative that defines life?
The narrative around discomfort needs to change.
I realize that as a person in a conversation,
that
a lot
I
of
may
my
be
job
walking a
is to
fine
These
line and
listen.
conversations
should
are
It's the only way
supposed to
to
open up a feeling that
misinterpretations
is
We should
from
hard
not be
to
afraid to
feel.
change. We should not be afraid to talk. We should not
We
be
should
afraid
not
to
be
be
afraid to
confronted.
learn. We should not be afraid to change. We should not be afraid
We should
to
not
talk.
be afraid to grow.
We should not
We
be
should not be
afraid to be
afraid to learn.
confronted.
We should not
We
be
need
afraid
to
to change.
listen.
We should not be afraid
We
to talk.
I
need
want to be
listen.
cautious.
We should not be afraid to be
overstep a line.
confronted. We need to listen. We need to listen. I want to be
These
cautious not to
conversations
put
are
words in other people's mouths.
I want to be
cautious not to overstep the line. I want to be cautious not to make assumptions that I do not have the authority to make.
I want to be cautious not to make assumptions that I do not have the authority to make.
I see that narrative directly affects
These conversations
our
are
lives.
supposed to be
I
hard to
realize
put
that
into
as a
words.
person in a dialogue.
We have to feel uncomfortable in order to make real change.
As a person in a conversation, a lot of my job is
I
to
realize
listen.
that I may be walking a fine line
Regarding
between
the
expected
issue
interpretation of an audience.
There is an issue regarding the narrative in our culture. There is a problem regarding the narrative in our culture. There is a circumstance to narrative.
The words
There is
that we
circumstance
use
to a
directly
narrative.
shape our perception of life.
Narrative comes with
circumstance.
There is no way to make change without going through moments of discomfort. Discomfort is the only way to achieve change.
The language that we use
The narrative
shapes the
defined by the
possibility
narrative.
of what we can
It
be.
is who writes the narrative who is empowered. How do we change the narrative that defines life?
How do we change the narrative?
How do we
I see
change the
that
narrative that
narrative
governs
shapes
The
life?
narrative around discomfort needs to change.
I see that narrative
I see that
shapes the
narrative
language
shapes the
we use.
connotations that
I
belong
realize
to our
that
words.
as a person in
I
conversation,
see that narrative
a lot of my
directly
job is
affects
to
our
listen.
lives.
We should not be afraid to grow. We should not be afraid to learn.
I
We should not be
see
afraid to
that
change. We
narrative
should not be
shapes
afraid
the
to talk.
connotations
We should not be
within our
afraid
words.
to be confronted.
How do we
I
change the
see that
narrative
narrative
that
shapes
governs
the
life?
connotations
We
within
I
need
see
to
that
listen.
narrative
The
shapes
narratives
the
that we
I
language.
see
We
that
need
narrative
to
shapes
listen.
the connotations that
How we are to
belong
live.
to our words. I see that narrative directly affects our
I see that
lives.
narrative shapes the connotations within
The
our
There
lives.
is
language
no
we
way
use
to make
directly
narrative
affects our
shapes
lives.
the
going
connotations
through
that belong
The
to our
words
lives.
that we use
discomfort.
directly
I see
affect
that
our
narrative
lives.
directly affects
The
our
words that we
lives.
use
The
directly
language
shape
we
our
use
perception
directly
of
affects our
life.
lives.
The
The
narrative
words
that we use directly shape our
affect our
I
perception
see
of
that
how we
narrative
are
shapes
to
The words
live.
that we use directly
notation
The
shape our
language that we
within our
perception of
use
life.
shapes how we
The
are to
narratives
relate
that
to
we
each
use
other.
directly shape our
The
perception of
language
how
that we
are to
use
live.
shapes the
The
possibilities
language
of
that
what
we
we can
use
be.
shapes how we relate to each
The
other.
language that we use
The
shapes the
language that we use
possibilities and
shapes the
limits of what we
possibilities
can
of what
be.
be.
There is an issue regarding the narrative
I
in
see
our
that
culture.
narrative shapes
There is
the
a problem
connotations
regarding the
that
narrative
belong
in
to
our
our
culture.
words.
There is circumstance
The
to
language that we
narrative.
use
The
shapes the
language that we
limits
use
around
shapes the
what we
possibilities
cannot
and
be.
limits of what we can be. The language that we use shapes the limits around
The
what we
language that
cannot
we
be.
use shapes the
Is
limits around what we
photography
cannot
mainly
be.
concerned with
I want to be
Regarding the
cautious
issue
not
of
to make
narrative
assumptions
and
that I do not
photography
have the
aware
authority
that
to
it
make.
creates a narrative.
I
As a
realize
person
that
in a
as a
conversation,
person in a
a lot of my
dialogue,
job
a lot of
is
my
to
job
listen.
is to listen.
I see that narrative shapes the
Are we
connotation
aware
that
that language
belongs
is
to
not
There is
our
There is an
words.
circumstance to
issue
a
regarding the
Are we
I see
aware
that
that
narrative
language is not
directly
confined
affects
to
our life.
representations and symbols?
Are we aware
There
that
is a
there are
problem
narratives that
regarding
we
the
cannot
narrative
speak?
in our culture.
Are we aware that there are
There is
narratives that we cannot
circumstance
write?
to a narrative.
Are we aware that language is
Narrative
not
comes
confined to
with
words?
Narrative comes with circumstance.
Are
Life
we
is
aware that
Life is
language
defined by
not
the
confined
narrative.
to
That there are
representation?
It is who
narratives
writes
that
the
we cannot
narrative
speak.
who is
Are we
empowered.
aware that narrative
Are
is
we
only
aware
a
that
particular
there are
way
How do we
narratives
change the
that we
narrative
cannot
that
write?
defines life?
Is photography mainly
we
concerned
change
with
the
creating
How do we
an
narrative
image?
change the
governs
narrative
life?
that defines life?
I see that narrative
How do we
shapes
change the narrative that
language we
governs
use.
life? I see that narrative shapes the
How do we
language we
change the
use.
narrative that
I see that
governs
narrative
life?
shapes the connotations within our words.
Are we aware that language is not confined to words?
I see that narrative directly
Are we aware that
affects
language
our
is not
lives.
confined
The language we
to
use directly
representations
affects our
and
lives.
symbols?
The words
I see that narrative
we
Are we
directly
aware
affects
that
our
directly
narrative
lives.
affect
The
our
is
language we
lives.
only a
use
particular
affects
way
directly.
The words
to
that we
use
use
language
directly
directly
shape
affects
our
our lives.
perception of life.
The words that we use
The
directly
narratives that
affect
we
our
use
lives.
directly shape
The
our
words that we use
perception
directly shape
of
our
how we are
perception
to
of
live.
life. The narratives that we
language
use directly shape our
shapes how we
perception
are
of
to
how we
relate
are
to
to
each other.
live.
The words
The
that we
language
use
that we
directly
use
shape our
shape
perception of
how
life.
we are how
The
we
narratives
are
that
to
we
relate
use
to each other.
directly shape our perception
The
of how we
language
are
that we
to
use
live.
shapes the possibilities
The
of
language
what
that
we
we
can
use
be.
shapes how we are
The
to relate
language that
to
we
each other.
use shapes the
The language that we
possibilities and
use
limits of
shapes
what
the
we can be.
possibilities of what we can
The
be.
language that we use
The language
shapes
that we
limits
use shapes
around
the
what we cannot
possibilities
be.
and limits of what we can be.
Is
The language that we
photography
use
mainly
shapes the
concerned with
limits
creating an image?
around what we cannot be.
Is photography aware that it
Is
creates a
photography
narrative?
mainly concerned with creating an
Are we
image?
aware that there are narratives?
Is
narratives
photography
that we
aware that it
cannot
creates a
speak?
narrative?
Are we
Are we aware that there are
narratives
narratives
that we
that we
write?
cannot speak?
Are we
aware that there are
language is not
narratives that we
confined
cannot
to
write?
Confined to words.
Are we
we
aware
aware
that language is not confined to words?
representations and
Are we
symbols?
aware that language is not confined
we
to
aware that
representations and
narrative-
symbols?
Are
we aware that
narrative
is only
a particular
way
language?
to use language?